The Damocles Gulf had long been a graveyard of ambition. For centuries, its star systems had swallowed fleets and armies, a testament to the Imperium's hubris. The latest endeavor, the Second Sphere expansion, was proving no different. It was a war waged on a dozen fronts against a multitude of horrors, and like all wars, it produced a vast surplus of the condemned. Murderers, traitors, cowards, and heretics gathered from the disciplinary stockades of 100 worlds were forged into the blunt instrument known as the Penal Legions. Among them, the Ninth Penal Crusade, the Hades Wardens, were considered the most expendable of all. They were the dregs of the dregs, the final, desperate solution for men and women whose sins were too great for a simple execution. Their final condemnation came in the form of a single world, designated Xylos. It was a rust-colored orb on the frayed edge of the expansion corridor, deemed strategically insignificant, yet flagged by explorator probes for anomalous energy readings. The grand strategists of the Segmentum Command, unwilling to risk valuable Astra Militarum or Emperor Forbid, Astartes assets on a potential ghost chase, assigned the task to the Hades Wardens. Their orders were simple and brutal: make planetfall, advance in force, and provoke a response from whatever lay sleeping beneath the crimson dust. They were bait, a screaming tide of flesh and ceramite sent to see what monsters would rise to feed. At their head was Colonel Evangeline Krieg. Once, she had worn the gray of Cadia, her name etched on fortress honor rolls. But Cadia had fallen, and in the desperate, chaotic retreats that followed, Krieg had made a choice, sacrificing a regiment of planetary militia to save the core of her own Cadian shock troops. The High Command called it cowardice and dereliction. She called it tactical necessity. Her arguments fell on deaf ears, and she was stripped of rank and honor, given command of the Hades Wardens as a life sentence. Her face, etched with the hard lines of a lifetime at war, was a mask of cold cynicism. She harbored no illusions about her legion or their mission. They were ghosts already dead. Her only duty was to ensure they died with some measure of purpose, however slight. The landing was unnervingly quiet. Thunderhawks and orbital landers, long since stripped of their machine spirit's grace and patched with scrap metal, touched down in billowing clouds of red dust. The silence that greeted them was absolute. No birdsong, no insectile chittering, not even the whisper of wind. The air was thin and sterile, tasting of ozone and ancient metal. Xylos was a world not just dead, but one that had never known life. The Hades Wardens disembarked, a ragged legion of 10,000 souls clad in mismatched flak armor, their laser guns bearing the scars of 100 different war zones. Their faces were a gallery of humanity's darkest impulses, yet as they formed ranks under the alien sky, a grim discipline took hold, the ingrained muscle memory of soldiers who, whatever their crimes, knew only war. For 3 days they advanced. They marched across endless plains of pulverized iron oxide, the crunch of their boots the only sound in the universe. They navigated canyons carved with unnatural precision, their sheer walls smooth as polished obsidian. Nothing. The anomalous energy readings the fleet had detected were now a deafening roar on their own auspexes, a structured rhythmic pulse emanating from deep underground, yet the surface remained inviolate. Morale began to fray, the eerie silence working on the minds of the condemned more effectively than any artillery barrage. On the 4th day, the message came from the fleet in high orbit. It was a clipped, formal astropathic signal relayed through the Legion's master Vox. Crusade Command to Warden Primus. Emerging Xenos threat in neighboring subsector Aurelia requires immediate fleet redeployment. Your objective is redesignated. Establish a fortified perimeter, continue reconnaissance, and await reinforcement. The Emperor protects. Krieg stood on the command deck of her Gorgon heavy transport, watching the signal translate across the datathane slate. She did not need to check the orbital scanners to know the truth. She could feel it in the sudden emptiness of the Vox channels, the cessation of the background chatter that was the lifeblood of an Imperial fleet. Master Vox technician Valerius, a gaunt man whose augmented eyes glowed with a faint blue light, confirmed her fears without being asked. "Colonel," he stated, his voice a dry rasp of static, "all fleet signatures are accelerating. Their trajectory is not towards subsector Aurelia, it is towards the Mandeville Point. They are leaving the system." Betrayal. It was so simple, so predictable, so utterly imperial. They were being abandoned. They were not to await reinforcement. They were to die a forgotten footnote in a forgotten campaign. Their very existence was now a logistical inconvenience, tidily excised from the Crusades' order of battle. A murmur spread through the ranks as the news was passed down. Some men cursed, others fell to their knees in manic prayer. A few simply laughed, the sound hollow and sharp in the dead air. Krieg keyed the legion-wide vox, her voice cutting through the rising panic with the authority of a razor. "Hades Wardens," she began, her tone devoid of comfort or hope. "Listen to me. Crusade Command has seen fit to grant us our final pardon. They have severed our chains. The sentences you carried, the crimes that brought you here, they are rendered meaningless. We are no longer prisoners of the Imperium." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We are free," she continued, a dangerous, bitter fire in her voice. "Free to choose how we meet our end. You can lie down and die in this dust, waiting for a rescue that will never come. Or you can stand with me. You can stand and fight whatever it is that slumbers beneath our feet. We were sent here to die for an emperor who has forgotten us. I say now we die for ourselves. We die for our own vengeance. We will force this world to show us its face, Ebu, and we will carve our names into it with our blood and last fires, so that even if the Imperium forgets, its enemies will remember that the Hades Wardens were here." As she finished, a deep, resonant tremor shook the very ground they stood on. It was not the tectonic shift of a natural planet. It was a slow, grinding sound, the sound of colossal machinery stirring from an aeons-long slumber. 100 kilometers to the north, a vast section of the plain began to retract, revealing a chasm of impossible depth, from which a sickly green light began to pulse, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced towards the condemned legion. The silence of Xylos was broken, replaced by the hum of an awakening god. The Hades Wardens, the damned and the forgotten, raised their weapons. Their war had begun. The green light that bled from the newly opened chasm was not the clean, energetic viridescence of plasma, nor the chaotic blaze of warp fire. It was a cold, dead light, the color of phosphor and poison, and it pulsed with the slow, inexorable rhythm of a colossal heart. It painted the underside of the low-hanging clouds and cast the forms of the 10,000 Hades Wardens in stark, skeletal relief. The tremor subsided, replaced by a low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the soles of their boots and resonated deep within their bones, a sound that felt older than mankind. For a long moment, the entire legion was frozen, a tableau of condemned souls staring into their own open grave. Colonel Krieg was the first to break the spell. Her mind, forged in the crucible of Cadia's final hours, processed the impossible sight not with terror, but with cold, tactical appraisal. "All units form bastion perimeter." Her voice cracked over the vox, sharp and clear. "Gorgons and Malcadors to the cardinal points. Heavy bolter teams establish overlapping fields of fire. I want a kill zone 1 kilometer deep in every direction. Move." The ingrained discipline of 10,000 lifetimes of war took over. Men who had been slack-jawed with dread now moved with purpose. The engines of the Legion's few armored vehicles roared to life, their growl of fleeting comfort against the tomb's ancient hum. Transports wheeled into place, their armored hulls becoming fortress walls. Sandbags, hastily filled with the rust-red soil, were stacked. Heavy weapons were mounted, their crews scanning the silent horizon with a desperate intensity. Aboard the command Gorgon, the iron sarcophagus, Master Vox technician Valerius worked silently at his console. Data feeds scrolled across the screen, a cascade of incomprehensible symbols interspersed with Imperial Gothic warnings. "Colonel," he said, not turning from his station, "the energy readings are monumental. The primary source is from the chasm, but the entire planetary crust is now a live power grid. It's not just a structure underground. The planet is the structure." He tapped a few runes and a new display appeared. It was a log of the final astropathic signals from the departed fleet. "As I suspected, we have been officially recorded as lost. Battle Group Omega has logged our mission as a resounding success, stating the 9th Penal Crusade valiantly identified and neutralized a minor Xenos outpost before being overcome. They are awarding us a posthumous citation." A vein throbbed on Krieg's temple. The sheer, calculated cynicism of it was breathtaking. They were not just abandoned. Their deaths were being used as a political victory, a minor triumph to be touted in segmentum command reports. They had been erased, their story rewritten before it had even ended. "So, "We are martyrs now, Valerius?" she asked, her voice laced with acid. "Did they mention which saint we will be petitioning for?" Valerius turned, his augmented eyes pulsing softly. "They did not, Colonel. The transmission also contained a full data purge command sent to our Legion's administrative cogitators. They intended to wipe our service records remotely, a final act of housekeeping. My own system architecture prevented the command from executing." His lips twisted into something that might have been a smile on a different man. "They are thorough, I will grant them that." Outside the transport, the perimeter was established. It was a pathetic fortress against the scale of the world they were on, a tiny circle of defiance in a landscape that was actively unmaking itself. The hours crawled by. The green light from the chasm remained constant, a silent, watchful beacon. Then, the phantom readings began. Sergeant Boros, a bull-necked man whose face was a roadmap of scar tissue from a dozen bar fights and one orc trench raid, was the first to report it. "Command, this is Perimeter 7. Auspex is acting up, getting fleeting returns, moving too fast to track. No visual." The reports began to trickle in from other sectors, ghostly signatures that would appear on a scanner for a microsecond before vanishing, energy spikes that flared and died. It was as if something was testing their senses, tapping against the shell of their reality to see what would break. Krieg ordered scout patrols to push out 1/2 kilometer from the main line. It was a risk, but she would not die blind. She chose the ghosts, a unit comprised of former hive gangers and assassins, men who were adept at moving unseen. 10 of them, led by a wiry killer named Jax, melted into the red twilight. For 20 minutes, their voxcasters clicked with standard check-ins. Then silence. Not static, not a cry for help, just perfect, absolute silence. Krieg hailed them. "Ghost lead, report status, over." Nothing. "Jax, respond, now." The Vox channel remained dead. It was as if the squad had never existed. A cold dread, more potent than any fear of battle, settled over the Legion. To be killed by an enemy was a soldier's fate. To simply cease to be was a horror of a different magnitude. Krieg knew then that to remain static was to be dissected piece by piece. Their makeshift fortress was not a bastion. It was a cage, and the butcher was sharpening its knives. She climbed atop the iron sarcophagus, her lean form silhouetted against the sickly green glow. She keyed the Legion-wide Vox again, her voice ringing out across the fortified camp. "Wardens, we have been betrayed. We have been erased. They left us here to die, and something in the dark is eager to oblige." She gestured with one gauntleted hand towards the silent expanse where the scout squad had vanished. 10 of our own are gone. They did not die in a firefight. They were taken. This enemy does not fight like we do. It does not announce itself with artillery and battle cries. It is a cancer in the soil, a phantom in the air. To wait here is to let it cut us out one by one, until nothing is left. She turned, her gaze fixed on the colossal chasm that dominated the horizon. "That is our enemy," she declared, her voice rising with a terrible conviction. "That chasm is its heart, its throne, its name. We were sent here as bait. We have flushed the beast from its lair. Now we will do what no sane soldier would. We will march down its throat. We will find out what it is, and we will broadcast that truth to the galaxy that left us to die. Let the record show that the Hades Wardens, in their final hour, stared into the abyss and spat in its eye. We will not die as forgotten records in a data purge. We will die as the warning that heralds a new and terrible war. Prepare to advance. We march on the green light." A murmur ran through the Legion, but it was not one of protest. It was a low growl of assent. They were the damned, the betrayed, the already dead. The choice between being silently erased in the dark or charging headlong into the source of their annihilation was no choice at all. One was an ending. The other was a legacy. Engines fired up once more, their guttural roars a challenge to the planet's hum. Ranks were formed not for defense, but for a final desperate assault march. The Hades Wardens, a legion of 10,000 ghosts, turned their back on the empty sky that had promised salvation and began their pilgrimage towards the glowing heart of Xylos, their footsteps the first verse in a saga of damnation. The advance was a slow, grinding procession into a world that was actively hostile to their presence. The thin, sterile air began to thicken with an almost imperceptible haze of emerald particles. microscopic motes of light that clung to armor and stung exposed skin. The ground, once stable, now felt strangely hollow, and with every kilometer the resonant hum from deep within the planet's crust grew in pitch and intensity. It was a physical pressure, a force that caused teeth to ache and vision to swim at the edges. The Hades Wardens marched on, their discipline a fragile shield against the creeping, unnatural dread. Colonel Krieg rode in the command cupola of the iron sarcophagus, her eyes fixed on the horizon-spanning chasm. The vast opening did not grow larger in a conventional sense. Rather, the world seemed to shrink around it, as if the chasm were the only true thing in this reality, and their legion was merely an insignificant mote drifting towards it. Beside her, Valerius monitored his suite of augers and scanners, his face a grim mask illuminated by the glow of the data screens. "The particulate matter in the air is metallic, Colonel," he reported, his voice a low monotone that did nothing to hide the tension. "Microscopic, self-replicating scarabs. They're not actively hostile, more like an atmospheric terraforming agent, or perhaps a sensor net. They are certainly reporting our composition, strength, and disposition." He gestured to a wavering pick display. "And the ground beneath us is a lattice, a network of tunnels and conduits on a scale that defies comprehension. We are not marching across a planet's surface. We are walking on the roof of a machine the size of a world." The first true sign of the awakening came without warning. Far ahead of the main column, one of the lumbering Malkador heavy tanks, the Emperor's Scorn, suddenly lurched to a halt. Its engines sputtered and died, its lights flickering out. The tank commander's voice came over the Vox, tight with confusion. "Command, Scorn is dead. All power systems have failed. We're trying to reboot the reactor spirit, but it's completely unresponsive." Before Krieg could respond, another tank went dark, then a chimera. Across the front of the Legion, vehicles began to fail, their machine spirits silenced by an unseen hand. It was not an attack, but a deactivation. An electromagnetic pulse of impossible precision was targeting and nullifying their power sources. Within minutes, the entire armored contingent of the Hades Wardens was inert, silent monuments of iron stranded in the red dust. The Legion was now an infantry force, stripped of its heavy support in the face of an unknowable enemy. Panic, cold and sharp, rippled through the ranks. The silence that followed the death of the engines was more terrifying than any roar of battle. It was then that the patrol vanished. A squad from the 3rd Company, tasked with scouting the left flank, had moved behind a low, mesa-like rock formation. One moment their squad-level Vox was reporting clear sight lines. The next, it was gone. Not a burst of static, not a garbled cry, just an instantaneous, complete absence of signal. Sergeant Valerius, the squad leader, was a veteran of a dozen brutal campaigns, not a man to be taken silently. Krieg immediately dispatched a Lehman Russ demolisher, one of the few tanks that had been shielded against EMP effects by Valerius's peculiar modifications. It rumbled towards the mesa, its demolisher cannon a promise of crude Imperial retribution. As it rounded the rock formation, the tank's Voxcaster crackled to life. The operator's voice was high, strained with disbelief and terror. "Command, by the throne, they're gone. The whole squad. Their gear. It's all here. Laser guns, packs, flak vests, just lying in the dust. But the men, there's no bodies, no blood. They've just vanished." A collective shiver went through the Legion. This was a new kind of war. The enemy did not kill. It unmade. It erased. Krieg felt a knot of cold fury tighten in her gut. They were being toyed with, dissected by an intelligence that viewed them as little more than curious biological specimens. "All units consolidate," she commanded, her voice a steel whip. "Form infantry squares, heavy weapons to the center. No one leaves the formation. No one." As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the plains, the planet itself began to change. All around the Legion, the ground shimmered. Shapes began to rise from the dust, pushing upwards with a silent, inexorable force. They were obelisks, pylons of a lustrous black metal that seemed to drink the light, each one dozens of meters tall and covered in shifting hieroglyphs that glowed with the same sickly green energy as the great chasm. They emerged in a perfect geometric pattern, surrounding the stranded Legion. They were not weapons. They were markers, Gravestones for an army that was not yet dead. The hum intensified, rising in pitch until it was an almost unbearable shriek that bypassed the ears and drilled directly into the skull. Astropaths within the Legion's small psyker contingent screamed and collapsed, blood pouring from their eyes and ears as their minds were shredded by the sheer alien pressure on the warp. Valerius grunted in pain, clutching the side of his head. "The structures are power conduits," he hissed through clenched teeth. "They're energizing the grid. They are preparing the field." Then, from the base of each pylon, the ground began to liquefy, turning from red dust into pools of shimmering silver liquid. The liquid metal churned and coalesced, rising up, taking on form and substance. First came tall skeletal frames, hunched and insectile, with multiple limbs ending in an array of surgical and combat implements. Canoptech wraiths, their single cyclopean eyes glowing with cold intelligence, phased into and out of reality, their forms flickering like faulty pit captures. They did not attack, merely circled the perimeter, their movements fluid and utterly silent, observing the terrified humans with detached curiosity. Behind them, larger forms assembled. From the silver pools rose legions of metal skeletons, their forms the stuff of ancient nightmares. They were Necron warriors, the foot soldiers of the dynasty. They stood in silent, perfect ranks, their Gauss flares held at a precise uniform angle. There was no sound, no war cry, no bellowing of orders. There was only the silent, synchronized lifting of 10,000 weapons, the green glow within their empty eye sockets fixing upon the huddled mass of the Hades Wardens. The air crackled with contained energy. The trap was sprung. The tomb of Xylos had finally fully awakened. The world that had been sterile and empty was now a stage, and the Hades Wardens were the final, tragic players upon it. The black stone pylons hummed with a palpable energy, their geometric perfection a stark insult to the ragged, organic lines of the human soldiers. The Legion was encircled, trapped within a prison whose walls were made of silent, unblinking metal legions. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but the darkness was held at bay by the cold, green luminescence that poured from the Necron ranks, and the colossal chasm that now dominated the sky. Xylos was no longer a planet. It was a vast open-air tomb, and the process of interment had begun. For an eternity that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, nothing happened. The two armies faced each other in absolute silence. Earth, a breathtaking tableau of flesh and metal, of transient life and eternal undeath. The Wardens, clutching their laser guns, their knuckles white, could hear their own ragged breathing, the frantic beating of their hearts. The Necrons were statues, perfect and still, their only movement the slow, hypnotic swirl of energy within their optical sensors. This was not the chaotic prelude to a battle with orcs or the gibbering war cries of chaos cultists. This was a clinical, cold-blooded execution being prepared. Then, as one, the Necron legions raised their Gauss flares. The air itself seemed to split apart as thousands of emerald bolts of energy were unleashed. It was not a volley in the human sense, a thunderous roar of massed fire. It was a single, coherent wave of silent molecular destruction. The bolts did not explode on impact. They simply erased what they touched. Men screamed as their flak armor and the flesh beneath it were unraveled at a molecular level, flayed into constituent atoms in a horrifying, silent green flash. Entire sections of the Warden's perimeter vanished, not in a spray of gore and shrapnel, but in puffs of vaporized matter and lingering ozone. A Lehman Russ demolisher, its hull thick enough to withstand artillery, was stripped layer by layer, its adamantium plating peeling away like ancient parchment before the crew inside were atomized. The Warden's return fire was a frantic, desperate cacophony. "Fire at will! Fire!" The cry was taken up by sergeants and corporals all along the line, a human roar of defiance against the silent apocalypse. Lasguns spat beams of red light that seemed pitifully weak against the tide of green. The beams sizzled and sparked against the living metal of the Necron warriors, scorching their chassis and, in rare focused volleys, melting through a joint or an optic sensor. A Necron would fall, its metallic body clattering to the ground, only to be enveloped in a shimmering green light a moment later. Its limbs would knit back together, its systems would reboot, and it would rise again, its weapon once more leveled at the human lines. They were not just soldiers, they were a self-repairing plague. Krieg stood her ground. On the command deck of the iron sarcophagus, the battle unfolding around her with horrifying speed. The outer ranks of her legion were evaporating. Heavy weapons target their larger constructs, she bellowed into the vox, her voice raw. Ignore the infantry, they're endless. Find a target that stays dead. Autocannon teams, their loaders slamming fresh clips into their weapons, with frantic haste pivoted their guns. They targeted the Canoptech wraiths that flickered at the edges of the battle. The explosive shells detonated against the wraiths' phased bodies, often passing straight through them as if they were ghosts. But a few found their mark, ripping through a necrodermis shell and shattering the complex chronometrium within. A wraith would explode in a shower of metal shards and a screech of twisted space-time, a small, fleeting victory in a sea of despair. The ground itself became a weapon. Sections of the crimson plain beneath the warden's feet suddenly retracted, dropping entire platoons into newly opened pits lined with crackling energy fields that incinerated them instantly. From other parts of the ground, razor-sharp metallic shards erupted, impaling men where they stood. The battlefield was a dynamic, shifting death trap, controlled by the unseen mind of the tomb. Amidst the slaughter, Valerius was a frantic blur of motion at his console. "Colonel, their command signals are everywhere and nowhere," he yelled over the din of battle. "It's a decentralized network, a gestalt consciousness running through the planet itself. But there are nodes, concentration points. The pylons, they're not just power conduits, they're signal boosters, amplifying the master command protocols." Just as he spoke, a new horror emerged from the Necron lines. Taller, broader, and more heavily armored than the warriors, these were the immortals, the elite guard of the dynasty. They strode forward, their Gauss blasters larger and more potent, cutting swaths through the human ranks. With them came the destroyers, their upper torsos fused to hovering skimmer platforms, their minds consumed by an insatiable hatred for all life. They glided above the battlefield, unleashing torrents of Gauss fire that turned squads into drifting ash. The warden's lines buckled and broke. The ordered formation collapsed into desperate pockets of resistance, small groups of men fighting back to back, their last fire a defiant flicker against the storm. Krieg watched as a company of men, their officer dead, was swarmed by a tide of metallic bodies. They fought with bayonets, with combat knives, with their bare hands, their Cadian curses mixing with the screams of the dying. It was a slaughter, but it was not a rout. Not yet. "We cannot win this fight," Krieg voxed, her voice grim and heavy with the truth. "We cannot hold this ground. All units fighting withdrawal. Fall back towards the chasm." A wave of disbelief and confusion answered her. Fall back towards the source of their doom. "That is an order," she roared. "Our objective has changed. We are no longer here to fight. We are here to learn. Valerius needs to get to the heart of their network. We are his escort. We will die, but we will not die ignorant. Move." Reluctantly, then with a grim sense of purpose, the surviving wardens began to disengage. It was a brutal, costly retreat. Every meter of ground was paid for with lives. Men sacrificed themselves in suicidal rearguard actions, holding off the advancing metal tide for a few precious seconds so their comrades could pull back. The iron sarcophagus, its hull scorched and pitted, acted as a mobile fortress, its sponson bolters chattering as it provided covering fire. The Legion, now reduced from 10,000 to perhaps half that number, stumbled back across the shifting, murderous landscape, leaving a trail of the dead and the atomized. They were no longer an army on the attack, but a desperate band of survivors plunging headfirst into the very abyss that sought to consume them, the greenlit maw of the great chasm looming before them like the gate to hell itself. The retreat to the chasm was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a desperate, bloody flight, a breaking wave of humanity receding from an inexorable tide of living metal. The world of Xylos had become a sentient abattoir, and the Hades Wardens were being herded towards the killing floor. The green glow from the chasm pulsed brighter, a malevolent beacon that seemed to mock their flight, welcoming them into its depths. Colonel Evangeline Krieg, standing exposed in the cupola of the iron sarcophagus, was the fulcrum of the entire retreat. Her voice, raw and amplified by the transport's voxcasters, was the only thing holding the shattered legion together. "Company commanders, report casualties and strength," she barked, her words cutting through the cacophony of battle. The responses were a litany of despair. 7th Company, less than 200 effective, heavy weapons lost. 12th Company, Throne Colonel, 12th Company is gone. Overrun 30 seconds ago. 3rd Company, we're down to platoon strength, ammunition critical. Krieg's mind was a maelstrom of cold calculation. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. Every reported loss was a variable in a grim equation of survival, a piece of a puzzle whose only solution was a slightly less immediate death. She processed the reports, Hercadian training a bedrock of stability in the swirling chaos. All units consolidate on my position, she commanded. Form a hollow spearhead. We are punching through. Valerius, how much longer until we are at the lip of the chasm? From inside the transport's humming command center, the tech adept's voice was strained. 5 kilometers, Colonel, but the terrain ahead is changing. On Krieg's tactical display, the ground between them and their terrible goal was shifting. Great walls of black metal erupted from the plains, forming a labyrinth designed to funnel them, to break their cohesion, to bleed them dry. The tomb was playing with them. It was in this moment of rising despair that Krieg's resolve hardened into something adamantine. She saw the faces of her soldiers, the murderers, the thieves, the cowards, and in their eyes she did not see criminals. She saw men and women condemned twice over, first by the Imperium and now by this silent Xenos god. They had been left to die as a forgotten footnote. She would not allow it. Her own disgrace, her lost Cadian honors, burned in her memory, not as a source of shame, but as fuel for a final, spiteful conflagration. Hades Wardens, her voice boomed across the battlefield, no longer just commanding, but inspiring, a clarion call of pure, undiluted defiance. Look around you. Look at the enemy that seeks to unmake us. It is perfect. It is eternal. It feels no pain, no fear, and it thinks we are nothing. It thinks we are vermin to be exterminated. We have been told this our entire lives. We are the dregs, the unwanted, the sinners fit only for death in a ditch on a forgotten world. She drew her bolt pistol, the weapon a symbol of a rank she no longer truly held, and aimed it not at the enemy, but towards the sky where the Imperial fleet had vanished. The Imperium that cast us out agrees with them. They wrote our eulogy before we had even fallen. They declared us dead to save themselves the trouble of a rescue. Her voice cracked with a fury that was both righteous and terrible. I say to hell with them all. We are not vermin. We are soldiers of the Imperium, and we will teach this galaxy what it means to be forgotten. We have been given one final duty, not to win, not to survive, but to bear witness. She swung her gaze back towards the chasm. We will march into that abyss not as victims, but as messengers. Every one of you who falls, your death buys our messenger one more second. Your blood will fuel the signal that screams our warning across the stars. We will give the Imperium the knowledge they were too cowardly to seek for themselves, and they will choke on it. They will remember the names of the men and women they sentenced to death on the zealous, on me for the honor of the damned. Charge! A roar erupted from the throats of the surviving wardens. It was a sound of primal fury, of men with nothing left to lose, a cathartic scream of rage against their fate. The fear did not vanish, but it was burned away by the heat of her words, replaced by a singular, unifying purpose. They were no longer retreating. They were attacking the only objective left to them, a meaningful death. The hollow spearhead formed around the iron sarcophagus, a wedge of desperate humanity aimed at the heart of the Necron labyrinth. They charged into the shifting maze. Walls of living metal rose and fell, attempting to split their formation, but Krieg, directing the charge from her vantage point, anticipated the changes, her tactical acumen honed by a lifetime of war. Left flank, suppress the immortals on the ridge. Right flank, demo charges on that rising wall. Forward element, follow me, drive through. The wardens fought with a ferocity that seemed to stun the methodical Necrons. They clambered over barricades of their own dead, their bayonets scraping against necrodermis. They fired their laser guns until the power packs ran dry, then used them as clubs. Colonel Krieg became a legend in those moments. She stood unflinching in the transport's cupola, bolt pistol barking, a chainsword scavenged from a fallen sergeant, roaring in her other hand. She was the eye of the storm, a figure of absolute resolve amidst the green-tinged chaos. She directed fire, identified threats, and her voice was a constant presence, a lifeline of command that kept the charge from collapsing into a panicked mob. She was no longer a disgraced officer. She was the incarnation of the Legion's final furious will. The survivors, now numbering less than 1,000, finally broke through the labyrinth. Before them lay the lip of the great chasm. It was a wound in the world, 800 kilometers long and dozens wide, plunging into depths that shimmered with emerald light and the silhouettes of impossible structures. A great causeway, a bridge of black metal wide enough for an army, extended from their position, leading towards a colossal pyramidal structure that floated in the center of the chasm, the source of the blinding light. The Necron forces did not pursue them onto the causeway. Instead, they lined the edge of the chasm, a silent, watching legion of executioners, their task of herding the cattle complete. The Hades Wardens, the last 1,000 souls, stumbled onto the bridge, their armor broken, their bodies bleeding, their numbers catastrophically depleted. They had reached the gate. Krieg, her face smeared with grime and alien ichor, looked at the ragged band of survivors around her. They were shattered, exhausted, and doomed, but they were here, and in their eyes she saw the reflection of her own terrible resolve. Their final objective was in sight. The causeway was a bridge of silent judgment. It stretched across the impossible gulf, a stark black line against the blinding emerald energies that churned in the depths below. The air here was thick with power, a static charge that made the warden's hair stand on end and caused their few remaining pict screens to flicker with ghostly images of arcane geometries. The scale of the chasm was an assault on the human mind. The floating pyramid at its center was not merely a building, but a suspended continent of metal and light, its peak lost in the artificial clouds of energy that roiled above. This was the sanctum sanctorum of the tomb, the throne room of the dynasty that ruled Xylos. The 1,000 survivors of the Hades Wardens, a tattered remnant of the original 10,000, stood at the entrance to this final path. Behind them, on the lip of the chasm, the Necron army stood in silent, motionless ranks. They were not an army in pursuit. They were an honor guard for the dead. Their purpose fulfilled, they made no move to follow. The path ahead was the only one left. Colonel Krieg dismounted from the iron sarcophagus, its battered hull groaning as it finally powered down, its machine spirit at last succumbing to the overwhelming energies of the tomb. She strode among her remaining soldiers, her gaze meeting the eyes of men she had led into the very heart of oblivion. There was no fear left in them, only a hollowed-out, fatalistic calm. They had survived a battle that should have annihilated them, and they knew it was only a temporary reprieve. "This is it," Krieg said, her voice surprisingly steady, carried by the strange acoustics of the chasm. "This is as far as our guns and our anger can take us. What lies ahead is a different kind of war." She looked towards Valerius, who was already detaching a portable auger array from the dead transport. "Valerius, what do you see?" The tech adept adjusted the optical sensors on his face, his gaze sweeping across the causeway and the pyramid beyond. "The structure is the dynasty's central processing crypt," he stated, his voice hushed with a heretical awe. "The energy readings are transcendent. It is not merely a command center. It is a data repository, a consciousness archive. The mind of every Necron in this system, perhaps this sector, is mirrored there. It is their immortality made manifest." He pointed a trembling metallic finger towards the pyramid's base. "There. The primary energy conduits converge at the entrance nexus. If I can interface with that point, I can access the master protocols, the entire dynasty's order of battle, their strength, their deployment patterns, their awakening schedule. Everything." The silent Necron legions on the chasm's edge began to stir. A pathway opened in their ranks, and from it emerged new figures, larger and more ornate than the warriors or even the immortals. They were Lichguard, the personal custodians of the Necron nobility. They were clad in heavier, segmented armor, bearing tall shields that shimmered with dispersion fields and wielding hyperphase swords, or massive war scythes whose blades vibrated with a low, hungry hum. They strode onto the causeway with a ponderous, unstoppable gait, their purpose clear, to guard the final approach. They were not a legion. There were perhaps only 100 of them, but the sheer menace they projected, the palpable aura of ancient power and lethal purpose, was more terrifying than the 10,000 warriors they had faced before. These were not mindless automata. In their glowing eye sockets, there was a flicker of cold, aristocratic disdain. Krieg watched them advance, her hand tightening on the hilt of her chainsword. The equation was simple and brutal. Valerius needed time, and the Lichguard were coming to deny it. The remaining 1,000 wardens were the only thing that stood in their way. "You heard him," Krieg said, turning back to her soldiers. "We are the shield. We will buy him that time. Every second you stand, every blow you strike, is a word in the message we are sending. We will hold this bridge, or we will die upon it." She looked at Sergeant Boros, the grizzled veteran whose face was a testament to a life of violence. "Boros, you have the line. Form a shield wall, 3 ranks deep. First rank, crouch and brace, bayonets and blades. Second rank, controlled volleys. Third rank, reload and replace casualties. No retreat, no surrender. This is the final fortress. Its walls are our bodies." Boros nodded, his scarred face grim. He turned and bellowed orders, his voice a gravelly roar. "Line up! By the throne, you heard the colonel. Form the wall. This is where we die, so let's die hard." The Hades Wardens, with a discipline born of utter hopelessness, formed their last line of defense. They were a pathetic sight against the grandeur of the tomb city, a thin line of bruised flesh and battered flak armor against an oncoming wave of immortal guardians. They checked their lasgun packs, knowing it would be the last time. They fixed bayonets, their blades gleaming dully in the green light. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a brotherhood of the damned. As the Lich Guard advanced, their footsteps echoing like the tolling of a great bell, another presence made itself known. The energy pouring from the pyramid's entrance intensified, and a figure emerged. It was taller than the Lich Guard, its form more slender and regal. It wore a high, crested helm and a flowing metallic cloak that seemed to be woven from solidified light. In one hand it held a staff that pulsed with a blinding green star, and its entire body was of a polished obsidian necrodermis that seemed to absorb the very light around it. There was a palpable sense of ancient intellect, of a will so vast and old it was beyond human comprehension. This was not a soldier, this was a king. Pharaoh Anhutek the Unsleeping, ruler of the Anhutek dynasty and master of Xylos, had come to personally oversee the cleansing of his sanctum. The true enemy, the mind behind the slaughter, was finally revealed. While the remnants of the Hades Wardens formed their desperate shield wall, a different kind of battle was being waged within the confines of Valerius's mind. The Master Vox technician was no soldier. His body was frail, his augmentations designed for precision and analysis, not the brutality of close combat. His war was one of symbols and signals, a conflict fought in the invisible realm of the noosphere, and he was now preparing to assault a fortress of data more vast and complex than any he had ever conceived. He knelt at the edge of the causeway, his back to the unfolding confrontation, and began to deploy his instruments with the methodical calm of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. He drove a series of silvery spikes into the living metal of the bridge, their tips humming as they sought purchase in the tomb's underlying data substrate. A web of fiber optic cables, their cores glowing with a soft blue light that seemed defiant in the overwhelming green of the chasm, connected the spikes to a central processing cogitator. This was Valerius's masterpiece, a machine of his own design, cobbled together from Mechanicus-grade hardware and Xenos tech he had acquired and studied during his long years of service and disgrace. It was a heretical engine, a blend of the sanctioned and the forbidden, and it was the only key that had any hope of unlocking the Necron crypt. "Colonel," he subvocalized over his private channel, his voice a tight whisper, "the network architecture is sublime. It is not code as we understand it. It is a form of sentient, evolving fractal geometry. To break their encryption would take a standard Mechanicus decryptor engine millennia." Krieg's voice came back, strained over the sound of her chainsword revving. "I do not have millennia, Valerius. I have minutes, perhaps less. Give me a miracle." "Miracles are the purview of the ecclesiarchy," Valerius replied dryly, his fingers dancing across a runic keyboard. "Ideal in applied logic." He connected a final cable, not to the cogitator, but to the data port at the base of his own skull. The world dissolved in a flash of blue-white light as his consciousness was drawn from his body and plunged into the data stream. He was adrift in an infinite, silent ocean of green light. Great structures of pure information, the fractal geometries he had detected, drifted past him like leviathans of the deep. This was the antechamber of the Necron network, a defensive layer of pure, overwhelming data designed to incinerate any foreign consciousness. He could feel its pressure on his own mind, the alien logic trying to unwrite his very thoughts, to reduce his human consciousness to a string of meaningless errors. He shielded his mind with the cold, hard logic of the cult mechanicus, reciting the litany of uninterrupted data flow as a mantra against the psychic onslaught. He was a trespasser here, a microbe in the bloodstream of a god. He needed to find the core. The central nexus Krieg was buying him time to reach with his body. He pushed deeper, following the great currents of information, the rivers of data that flowed from the legions of Necrons on the battlefield to the central pyramid. He saw the reports of the battle from the Necrons' own perspective. Cold, emotionless logs of terminated biologicals, efficiency ratings, and damage assessments. To them, the desperate last stand of the Hades Wardens was nothing more than a pest control operation, a series of calculations. He felt a presence then, a vast and ancient intelligence that turned its attention towards him. It was a sentience of cold, patient superiority, the gestalt consciousness of the tomb's master program. It was not hostile, not yet. It was curious. It examined his mind, his memories, his very being, with the detached interest of a biologist studying a new specimen. Valerius felt his life flash before him, his training on Mars, his illicit studies of Xenos tech, his disgrace, his condemnation to the Penal Legion. The Necron intelligence sifted through it all, and Valerius could almost feel its conclusion. Primitive, chaotic, insignificant. That flicker of disdain was the opening he needed. The master program had dismissed him as a harmless anomaly. He shielded his true intent behind a facade of panicked, disorganized thoughts, projecting the image of a simple human mind breaking under the strain. While the master program's attention was diverted, he followed a data conduit so vast it dwarfed all others, a veritable river of command protocols flowing directly from the Pharaon himself. This was the main line, the direct link to the central crypt. He plunged into the stream, and the pressure increased 1,000-fold. This was the raw, undiluted will of the dynasty. He saw star charts of empires that had risen and fallen 60 million years before humanity had crawled from the mud of Terra. He saw the biotransference, the terrible pact that had traded Necrontyrs' souls for immortal metal bodies, a silent, screaming holocaust of a billion minds. He saw the long sleep, the patient waiting in the dark as lesser species inherited the galaxy. And he saw the awakening. He had found it. The awakening protocols, it was all there, a complete and terrifyingly detailed blueprint for the reclamation of the galaxy, the locations of 100 tomb worlds, the full disposition of the Enhutech dynasty's legions and fleets, their command hierarchy, their fail-safe codes, their strategic objectives. It was a prize beyond comprehension, the single greatest intelligence coup in the history of the Imperium, but it was shielded by layers of encryption so complex they made his mind ache. They were living locks, sentient firewall demons woven from pure mathematics. Valerius knew he could not break them, but he realized with a sudden brilliant flash of heretical insight that he did not have to. The Imperium did not need the data decrypted, it simply needed to know that it existed. The sheer volume and complexity of the protocols, if broadcast raw, would be its own undeniable proof. The data scream itself would be the message. It would burn out the minds of any astropath who received it, but the psychic echo, the sheer alien weight of it, would be enough. The High Command would know. They would understand the magnitude of the threat. He began to configure his portable cogitator, not as a decryption engine, but as a broadcast conduit. He would act as a living bridge, allowing the raw Necron data to flow through his own consciousness and out into the void through his custom-built transmitter. The process would destroy him. The sheer volume of data, the alien nature of it, would scour his mind and incinerate his synapses. It was a death sentence, but one he embraced with the cold satisfaction of a scholar who has solved the ultimate equation. His revelation was complete. All that remained was the final, terrible act of publication. On the black metal causeway, the laws of attrition had been replaced by a brutal, unforgiving arithmetic. 1,000 desperate men stood against 100 perfect killers. The Lich Guard of the Enhutech dynasty did not charge. They advanced. Their pace was measured, inexorable, the tread of immortals who had measured time in geological epochs. The air grew heavy with the hum of their dispersion shields and the almost subsonic vibration of their hyperphase weapons. The Hades Wardens watched them come, a line of grim-faced ghosts. The first rank was a solid wall of flak armor and sharpened steel. Sergeant Boros stood at its center, his knuckles white on the haft of a salvaged power axe, its energy cells sputtering erratically. He spat a wad of bloody phlegm onto the black metal. "Hold the line, ha!" he roared, his voice a gravelly anchor in the rising storm of tension. "Let them get close. Let's make the bastards work for it." The second rank raised their laser guns, the red aiming beams dancing across the ornate carapaces of the advancing Lich Guard. "First volley on my mark," a lieutenant screamed, his voice cracking. "Target the joints. The optic sensors make every shot count." The distance closed. 300 meters, 200. The sheer, intimidating presence of the Necron Praetorians was the physical force, pressing down on the Wardens, testing their nerve. At 100 meters, the lieutenant's nerve broke. "Fire! For the Emperor! Fire!" A ragged volley of last fire erupted from the Warden's line. Red beams of light, a testament to humanity's defiance, lanced across the gap. The vast majority of the shots dissipated harmlessly against the shimmering dispersion fields of the Lich Guard's shields, the energy absorbed and shunted into harmless light and heat. A few lucky shots, or perhaps well-aimed ones, found their way around the shields, striking the Lich Guard themselves. The beams sizzled and scored the necrodermis, but did little more. One concentrated burst struck a Lich Guard in its single optic sensor. The construct faltered for a half-second, its head twitching, before it recalibrated and continued its advance, utterly unimpeded. The volley had been as effective as throwing stones. A wave of despair washed over the human line. Their primary weapons were useless. The Lich Guard did not even deign to return fire. They simply continued their implacable march. At 50 meters, they broke into a charge, a silent, synchronized surge of speed that was terrifying in its fluid precision. They covered the remaining distance in a heartbeat, crashing into the Warden's shield wall, not with a roar, but with the cold, hard clang of metal on metal and the sickening crunch of bone and armor. The battle became a maelstrom of desperate close-quarters butchery. The Wardens in the first rank met the charge with bayonets and combat knives. The steel screeched and scraped against living metal, the blades snapping or skittering off harmlessly. The Lich Guards' return blows were devastating. War scythes, impossibly heavy, swung in graceful, terrifying arcs, cleaving men in two, bisecting torsos and shearing through flak armor as if it were paper. Hyperphase swords flickered into and out of molecular alignment, passing through shields and breastplates to sever limbs and quench lives in a single, silent cut. Sergeant Boros roared a curse and swung his power axe in a desperate arc. The sputtering weapon met the shaft of a Lich Guard's war scythe. For a moment, the two weapons locked, the axe's failing power field crackling against the ancient alien metal. The Necron, with a simple, contemptuous twist of its wrist, disarmed the human, sending the axe spinning into the chasm. Before Boros could react, the butt of the war scythe slammed into his chest, cracking his ribcage and sending him sprawling. The first rank of the Wardens dissolved in a matter of seconds, a wave of humanity broken and slaughtered. The Lich Guards stepped over their corpses and crashed into the second rank, their blades continuing their silent, methodical work. Men fired their laser guns at point-blank range, screaming in rage and terror, the beams washing over the Necrons' impervious forms. The cost of this futile resistance was measured in a currency of blood and lives. For every meter of the causeway they held, a dozen Wardens died. For every Lich Guard that was slowed for a moment by the sheer press of bodies, a platoon was eviscerated. The Legion was not just being defeated, it was being systematically disassembled, its component parts of flesh and bone discarded with industrial efficiency. From the rear, Colonel Krieg watched the slaughter, her face an unreadable mask of stone. She knew this was the price. This horrific one-sided massacre was the cost of Valerius's revelation. Her Legion, her condemned, forgotten children, were being rendered down into the seconds and minutes he needed. She saw a young trooper, barely a man, impaled on a hyperphase sword. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, a look not of fear, but of grim understanding before the light faded from them. The Legion was shrinking, the initial 1,000 dwindling to 800, then 600. The shield wall had collapsed into a chaotic, swirling melee, a hopeless scrum of men trying to drag down the metal giants through sheer weight of numbers. They clung to the Lich Guard's legs, stabbing uselessly at their joints with knives, their cries of defiance swallowed by the vast, silent chasm. The cost of knowledge was staggering, a mountain of corpses piled on the bridge to eternity. Each death was a scream of defiance, a brief, bloody testament to the fact that they had stood here, on this final ground, and paid the ultimate price for a warning they themselves would never see delivered. The grinding, one-sided slaughter on the causeway had reached a critical point. The Hades Wardens were being systematically erased, their numbers dwindling with every swing of a war scythe. They had been reduced to a ragged knot of fewer than 300 men, a small, bloody island of defiance in a sea of encroaching, silent death. The Lich Guard, their forms unscratched and their advance barely impeded, pressed in relentlessly. The desperate gambit was failing. The shield wall of human flesh was breaking faster than anticipated. Valerius would not have enough time. Colonel Krieg, watching the final dissolution of her legion, knew that a new, more terrible sacrifice was required. Her tactical mind, cold and sharp even in the face of annihilation, saw the unfolding disaster not as an end, but as a final, critical variable. The core of the problem was the Lich Guard's invulnerability. They were impervious to small arms, and the Warden's few remaining crack grenades were too slow and clumsy to be effective against the swift, implacable Praetorians. A conventional defense was impossible, therefore an unconventional one was required. Her gaze fell upon the remaining heavy weapons teams. Most had been overrun in the initial charge, but 2 squads, armed with heavy bolters, had survived, their positions near the rear of the formation. Their weapons were all but useless against the Lich Guard, the explosive bolts detonating harmlessly against their necrodermis. But the ammunition packs? They were a resource of a different kind. Krieg keyed a private Vox channel, her voice cutting through the panicked transmissions of the dying. "Sergeant Malachi, Corporal Jorich, report to me. Bring your remaining ammunition crates. All of them." A moment later, 2 grim-faced men, their uniforms caked with blood and grime, hustled to her side. They represented the sum total of her remaining heavy firepower. Between them, they carried 4 large metal crates of heavy bolter shells. "Colonel," Malachi grunted, his breathing heavy, "the line is broken. We can't hold them." "We are not holding them, Sergeant," Krieg replied, her voice eerily calm. She knelt and unlatched one of the crates, revealing the tightly packed, fist-sized shells within. "We are going to create a diversion, a final, definitive one." She began to expertly wire the crates together, her hands moving with a practiced familiarity that spoke of 100 desperate battlefield improvisations. She was linking the detonation caps of the shells, creating a daisy chain, turning 4 crates of ammunition into a single, massive improvised explosive. Malachi's eyes widened in understanding. "By the throne, a suicide run." "There are no other kinds of runs left for us," Krieg said, without looking up from her work. She armed the device with a simple pressure-release detonator scavenged from a demolition charge. "I need volunteers. I need 10 men who are prepared to carry this into the heart of their formation. You will not come back. Your only objective is to detonate this payload at the densest concentration of the enemy. You will create a breach, a moment of chaos. That is all." Before Malachi or Yorick could even respond, a dozen men stepped forward from the dwindling knot of fighters. Their faces were hollowed out by exhaustion and despair, but their eyes burned with a feverish light. They were men who had already accepted their deaths, and the chance to make it count for something was the only salvation they had left. Krieg looked at each of them, her gaze lingering for a moment, memorizing their faces. She was sending them to certain, violent oblivion. "Your names will not be recorded in any honor roll," she told them, her voice low and intense. "No statues will be raised for you. But know this, the fate of this entire sector, perhaps more, will be decided by what you do in the next 90 seconds. You are the fulcrum upon which history will turn. Make it count." She finished her work and stood. The 4 crates, now fused into a single deadly package, sat menacingly on the black metal. 4 men were chosen to carry it, their comrades forming a tight protective wedge around them. They were the Forlorn Hope, a suicide squad on a mission of absolute finality. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Pike, who had been sentenced to the Legion for killing his own commissar, gave Krieg a grim final salute. "For the damned," Pike said, his voice a low growl. "For the damned," Krieg replied. The Forlorn Hope charged. It was a spear of pure suicidal intent, aimed at the thickest part of the Lich Guard line. They did not try to fight. They simply pushed, shoved, and clawed their way forward, their bodies absorbing blows from hyperface swords and war scythes meant for others. They were a living shield for the bomb they carried. Men were sliced in half, decapitated, but the survivors surged forward, stepping over the bodies of their comrades, their eyes fixed on their goal. Pike and the 3 other carriers were struck a dozen times, their flak armor shredded, their bodies bleeding from a score of wounds, but they did not fall. Fueled by a fanaticism born of utter despair, they drove themselves into the very center of the Lichguard formation. The immortal Praetorians, for the first time, showed a flicker of something akin to confusion at this illogical, self-destructive tactic. Pike, his body broken and his lifeblood pouring onto the causeway, finally reached his destination. With his last breath, he screamed a final obscene curse at the silent metal giants around him and released the pressure trigger. The explosion was apocalyptic. 4 crates of heavy bolter shells detonated simultaneously, a massive concussive roar that momentarily deafened everyone on the bridge. It was a dirty, brutal blast of pure kinetic force and shrapnel. For a 10-meter radius, everything was annihilated. The Lichguard caught in the heart of the blast were not just damaged, they were ripped apart. Necrodermis, which had shrugged off last fire, was torn and shredded by the sheer, overwhelming force of the explosion. 3 of the Lichguard were instantly destroyed, their bodies reduced to twisted, blackened scrap. 4 more were heavily damaged, their limbs blown off, their systems flickering as they struggled to self-repair. The gambit had worked. A bloody, ragged hole had been punched in the Necron line. The advance of the Lichguard faltered, their perfect formation broken by this unexpected act of human insanity. It was only a momentary pause, a brief window of chaos in the face of an eternity of order. But for Valerius, a moment was all he needed. The Hades Wardens, at the cost of their most fanatic souls, had bought their messenger his final precious seconds. The thunderous echo of the explosion rolled across the chasm, a brutal human retort to the tomb's cold, silent symphony. A ragged cheer went up from the surviving wardens, a sound of grim triumph quickly choked by the acrid smoke and the stench of burnt metal and flesh. The breach in the Lichguard line was a horrific tableau of shattered necrodermis and the atomized remains of the forlorn hope. For a few precious seconds, the implacable advance of the Necron Praetorians was halted, their orderly ranks thrown into disarray by a tactic so self-destructive it defied their cold machine logic. It was into this fleeting moment of chaos that Farron and Hutek the Unsleeping chose to descend. He did not stride from the pyramid's gate. He simply was there, having moved across the causeway with a speed that seemed to bend reality. He appeared amidst his faltering Lichguard, a figure of serene and terrible majesty. The emerald star in his staff of light pulsed with an angry, incandescent glow, and the air around him crackled with raw power. His polished obsidian form was untouched by the blast, his regal bearing a stark contrast to the brutal chaos around him. He surveyed the scene with an air of profound disappointment, as a master artisan might gaze upon a flaw in a perfect tapestry. His gaze swept over his damaged Lichguard, then across the blood-soaked causeway, and finally settled on the ragged band of fewer than 200 humans who still stood against him. His focus, however, was not on the soldiers. With an intelligence that transcended mere sight, he perceived the true threat, the surge of illicit data theft originating from the kneeling, insignificant figure of Valerius. The vermin were not just dying loudly. One of them was attempting to steal the sacred litanies of his dynasty. It was an act of blasphemy so profound it demanded personal retribution. At the other end of the causeway, Colonel Krieg saw him. Her eyes, accustomed to the chaos of battle, immediately locked onto the new figure. She recognized the aura of supreme command, the absolute centrality of this new being. This was the mind of the tomb, the king on his own battlefield. All pretense of a structured defense was gone. The Legion was a shattered remnant, their heroic sacrifice having bought them only a handful of seconds. There was only one final act left to play. "It's me he wants," Krieg said, her voice a low murmur, almost to herself. She knew the ancient, terrible etiquette of war. The 2 commanders, the 2 opposing wills, were now present. The final confrontation was at hand. This was not a tactical decision. It was an inevitability, a closing of a fatal circle. "Boros!" she yelled, her voice finding its strength again. The grizzled sergeant, somehow still alive despite his shattered ribs, staggered to his feet. "Get Valerius out of here, now! Form a perimeter around him and get him to the gate. That is your only objective. Do not let anything stop you." "Colonel, what about you?" Boros rasped, spitting blood. Krieg looked at the advancing Farron, her own chainsword revving to life, its metal teeth screaming in anticipation. "I'm buying you more time," she said, a grim, final smile touching her lips. "I am the command structure. As long as I am here fighting him, their primary objective will be me. Go. That is my last order to you, Sergeant." With that, she charged, not towards the safety of the pyramid's gate, but directly towards the Necron overlord. It was a suicidal, insane act, the final defiance of a commander who refused to die on the defensive. Her charge was a singular act of will against an eternal power. The remaining Lich Guard, their ranks beginning to reform, turned their weapons on her, but the Farron raised a hand, a gesture of command that was both fluid and absolute. The Lich Guard halted. This kill was his. Krieg ran across the causeway, a lone human figure against the backdrop of the cosmic abyss. The Farron strode to meet her, his staff of light crackling. The final battle for Xylos would not be a clash of armies, but a duel between two beings who embodied the very essence of their respective races, the desperate, fleeting, and indomitable spirit of humanity, versus the cold, eternal, and arrogant perfection of the Necrons. They met in the center of the bridge, a vortex of violence surrounded by a circle of silent, watching Lich Guard and the few dozen remaining Wardens who now fought a desperate, retreating battle to protect Valerius. Krieg swung her chainsword in a wide, roaring arc, aimed at the Farron's head. The Necron Lord did not even bother to parry with his staff. He simply tilted his head, the whirring blades passing a millimeter from his ornate helm. With his free hand, he backhanded her, a contemptuous, almost lazy blow. The force of the impact was immense. Krieg was thrown through the air like a rag doll, her Cadian-forged carapace armor cracking under the strain. She landed hard, rolling across the metal ground, her body screaming in protest. She staggered back to her feet, blood trickling from her lips. Her bolt pistol was in her other hand. She fired, the mass reactive shell exploding against the Farron's chest. The blast would have vaporized a lesser creature, but it barely scratched the living metal of the Necron Lord, leaving only a blackened scorch mark that was already beginning to repair itself. Anhutek watched her, his head cocked with a semblance of curiosity. He could have atomized her with a glance, but he seemed to be savoring the moment, studying this primitive creature's pointless struggle. He spoke, his voice not a sound but a direct transmission into her mind, a voice of dry dust and ancient stars. "Your species is, tenacious," the voice echoed in her skull. "Like bacteria, you resist the inevitable. You struggle in the face of your own extinction. It is your single defining and most tiresome quality." "We call it courage," Krieg spat, charging again, her chainsword a blur of motion. "You should try it sometime, you metal bastard." The clash of titans had begun, an apocalyptic duel on a bridge between life and death, hope and oblivion. The duel was a grotesque mismatch, a master swordsman dispassionately dismantling a frenzied child. Colonel Krieg fought with the desperate, ferocious courage of the truly doomed. Every ounce of her Cadian training, every hard-won lesson from 100 battlefields, was poured into a flurry of attacks. She ducked and weaved, her chainsword a constant screaming threat, seeking any conceivable weakness in the Farron's perfect form. Yet for every blow she delivered, Anhutek offered a response that was both effortless and utterly crushing. He did not fight her, he dissected her. He parried her roaring chainsword with the haft of his staff of light, the impacts resonating with a dull clang that sent jarring vibrations up her arms. He moved with a liquid grace that defied his metallic frame, sidestepping her lunges, his movements so economical and precise that he seemed to be existing a fraction of a second ahead of her. He allowed her to exhaust herself, to spend her last reserves of strength against his infinite patience. "Your efforts are illogical," his voice echoed in her mind, a cold, analytical counterpoint to the fury of their combat. "The outcome of this encounter was determined 60 million years ago, when our star gods granted us this perfect, eternal form. Your struggle is a rounding error in the grand calculus of the cosmos." "We're not a calculation," Krieg roared, her voice raw. She feinted with her sword and fired her bolt pistol at his knee joint. The shell detonated, and for the first time, the Farron staggered, a flicker of surprise in his cold optic sensors. A sliver of necrodermis had been blasted away, revealing the glowing green circuitry beneath. The wound sealed itself in a matter of seconds, but it was a victory, however small. A mortal had made an immortal bleed light. While this epic confrontation raged, A different, more desperate struggle was taking place 100 meters away. Sergeant Boros, rallying the last 30 or so wardens, had formed a tight, shrinking circle around Valerius. The remaining Lich Guard, their master occupied, now pressed their attack, determined to exterminate the last of the human vermin. It was a brutal, close-in fight, a maelstrom of screaming men and silent killing machines. Boros, wielding a fallen Lich Guard's massive war scythe with the crude strength of a beast, fought like a man possessed, his every breath a curse, his every blow a testament to his refusal to die quietly. "Protect the tech priest," he bellowed, his voice thick with blood. "He is our legacy. Give him the time." His men responded, throwing themselves in front of the Lich Guard's blades, their bodies becoming a living barricade. They were no longer fighting for their own lives. They were fighting for the life of the message. It was in this moment, as Krieg was disarmed by a flick of the Farron's staff and Boros's makeshift line was about to be overwhelmed, that Valerius completed his work. A final string of alien. Code flowed through his mind and into the broadcast engine. His body convulsed as the full, unimaginable weight of the Necron awakening protocols surged through his consciousness. "The bridge is open, Colonel," he whispered over the Vox, his voice distant and strange, the voice of a man already becoming a ghost in the machine. "I am transmitting." He pressed the final rune on his console. From the portable cogitator, a beam of pure, incandescent blue-white light erupted, lancing up from the chasm and into the dark, star-dusted void. It was not a radio wave or a psychic scream in the conventional sense. It was a raw, unshielded data scream, a torrent of pure information, so dense and alien that it tore a momentary hole in reality itself. It was the digital ghost of an entire Necron Dynasty, unleashed into the galaxy. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. On the distant agri-world of Viridia, in a fortified tower surrounded by fields of grox, the astropath primus of the Viridian Vigilance Choir was enjoying a cup of recaf. As the Hades Wardens' signal brushed against his mind, his eyes widened, the pupils dilating to swallow the irises. He did not even have time to scream. His head simply exploded, a shower of bone and psychic energy that painted the walls of his sanctum. Across the sector, every astropath, every sensitive soul, felt a wave of pure alien dread wash over them, a terrifying premonition of a rising ancient darkness. The message had been sent. On the causeway, the Farron froze. The data scream was an unimaginable violation, a desecration of his dynasty's most sacred archives. He turned his head, his full malevolent attention finally shifting from Krieg to the source of the broadcast. In that moment of distraction, Krieg, battered and broken, saw her final, terrible opportunity. The gambit had succeeded. The warning was out. All that remained was spite. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, she lunged not for a weapon, but for the cluster of cracked grenades still strapped to her belt. Her fingers, slick with her own blood, fumbled with the activation studs. The Farron, sensing her intent, turned back, his staff of light beginning to glow with killing power. He was too late. Krieg looked up at the towering metal god king, her face a mask of bloody, triumphant defiance. "For Cadia," she whispered, and pressed the detonators. The explosion was a brilliant, blinding flash of light and fury. The last broadcast had been sent. The final act of vengeance was about to be delivered. The detonation of Colonel Krieg's grenades was not a strategic act. It was a final, primal scream of defiance given form. The causeway, which had withstood the cosmic energies of the tomb for millions of years, buckled and cracked under the focused, explosive fury. A blinding white light momentarily overwhelmed the chasm's emerald glow, and a shockwave ripped across the bridge, a physical manifestation of Krieg's spite. Farron Anhutek, caught at point-blank range, was engulfed in the heart of the blast. His ancient, perfect form, which had shrugged off bolt shells and chainswords, was violently assaulted. The sheer concussive force and molten fury of the detonating grenades tore at his necrodermis, ripping away his metallic cloak of light and blasting chunks from his ornate carapace. He was thrown backward, not with the undignified tumble of a mortal, but with the majestic slide of a toppled idol, his feet carving smoking gouges in the black metal of the bridge. When he came to a stop, his form was blackened, pitted, and for the first time, visibly damaged. The green star of his staff flickered, and the regal light in his optics dimmed for a fraction of a second. He was not destroyed, not even close, but he had been wounded. He had been touched by the messy, chaotic violence of a lesser being, and his perfection had been marred. For Krieg, there was only oblivion. She was not merely killed, she was unmade, her body and soul consumed by the fire of her own final act. There was no corpse left to honor or desecrate, only a lingering scorch mark on the causeway, a dark human-shaped sigil of sacrifice. Her last act was not a prayer, but a curse given explosive form. The shockwave from the blast radiated outwards, striking the remaining combatants with the force of a physical blow. The last handful of wardens huddled around Valerius were thrown to the ground. The Lich Guard, too, were staggered, their advance momentarily broken. In the ensuing chaos, with the Pharaon momentarily stunned and his Praetorians in disarray, Sergeant Boros saw their only chance. "He's done it!" Boros roared, gesturing to the still glowing broadcast engine beside Valerius's now limp body. "The Colonel bought us our ticket. Get him through the gate, now!" Valerius had collapsed, his physical form unable to withstand the strain of his mental battle. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose and the sockets of his optical augments. His mind was gone, burned out by the sheer alien complexity of the data he had channeled, but his body was still alive. He was no longer a man, but a vessel containing the ghost of the signal, the living proof of their sacrifice. The last 20 wardens did not hesitate. They hauled the unconscious tech adept to his feet, two men slinging his arms over their shoulders, and began a desperate stumbling run towards the pyramid's massive entrance. The Lich Guard, recovering their composure, began to pursue, their silent forms closing the distance with terrifying speed. The wardens fought a desperate retreating action. Men turned and fired their last few las rounds, not to kill but to slow the advance. They threw their now useless guns, their combat knives, anything to buy another second. Boros was the heart of the rear guard. Wielding the captured war scythe, he became a whirlwind of brutal, unrefined destruction. The weapon was too heavy, too alien for him to use with any skill, but he swung it with the sheer brute force of a man who knew he was already dead. He smashed a Lich Guard's legs from under it, sending it crashing to the ground. He parried a hyperface sword, the impact shattering every bone in his arm, but he held on, his face a mask of agony and determination. They reached the colossal gate of the central pyramid just as the Lich Guard were upon them. The entrance was a perfect, seamless wall of black metal, but as they approached, it shimmered and dissolved, revealing a corridor of pulsating green light within. "Get him inside," Boros bellowed, turning to face the oncoming tide alone. He stood in the gateway, a broken, bleeding giant, and raised the war scythe for one last stand. "The rest of you, go. Find a hole. Find a cogitator, something. Bar the door. Do whatever you have to do." The few surviving wardens scrambled into the pyramid's interior, dragging the comatose Valerius with them. Boros met the first Lich Guard's charge with a roar, his war scythe swinging in a wide, suicidal arc. The antechamber of the tomb became a shattered front, a chaotic, desperate battleground where the last remnants of the Hades Wardens fought to secure the legacy their colonel had died to create. The shattered causeway, littered with the bodies of men in the wreckage of machines, stood as a silent testament to the catastrophic cost of their spiteful warning. The aftermath of the astropathic data scream was not a wave of understanding, but a cataclysm of psychic agony that tore through the segmentum pacificus. On the fortress world of Proxima Argol, Lord Inquisitor Valerius Hahn of the Ordo Xenos was in the midst of a lengthy, tedious debrief regarding the resounding success of the Second Sphere Expansion's Vanguard action on Xylos. The report, penned by Battlegroup Omega's own command staff, was a masterpiece of Imperial bureaucracy, lauding the courage of the martyred Ninth Penal Crusade and recommending posthumous commendations. Hahn, a man whose cynicism had been calcified over 2 centuries of service, was reading the report with a profound sense of weary disgust when the choir master of the fortress's astropathic sanctum burst into the chamber, his robes disheveled and his face pale with terror. He was followed by 2 medici servitors carrying a body bag. "My Lord Inquisitor," the choirmaster stammered, "an event of unprecedented magnitude. A full third of the Argol choir is dead, their minds liquidated. Another third is insane, lost to the echo." He gestured frantically at the body bag. This was Master Astropath Grolius. His last thought before his cerebral cortex ignited was a single repeating concept. Image, a warning. Hahn stood, his cold gray eyes narrowing. He had felt it himself, a faint discordant tremor in the warp, a psychic shriek so alien it had made the fillings in his teeth ache. "Show me," he commanded. They brought him to the sanctum. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and cooked meat. Surviving astropaths huddled in corners, weeping or muttering nonsense, their minds shattered by the psychic backlash. In the center of the chamber, a junior psyker, his eyes bound in strips of sanctified parchment, was being held upright by two scribes. He was the only one who had received even a fragment of the message and retained a sliver of sanity. "He can project the echo," the choir master whispered, "but it is faint and terrible." The psyker began to tremble, his hands clenching and unclenching. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips, and then a psychic image bloomed in the minds of everyone present. It was not a clear picture, but a chaotic, nightmarish collage of sensations and ideas. They felt the cold of a million years' sleep. They saw the stark, perfect geometry of a world made of metal. They witnessed legions of skeletal automata rising from the dust, and woven through it all, a complex, terrifying tapestry of strategic data, star charts of unknown antiquity, and command protocols of a complexity that defied human logic. It was a blueprint for a war of extermination on a galactic scale, and beneath it all, faint but insistent, was another layer, a human layer, the psychic imprint of grit, betrayal, and a final, burning, incandescent spite. The echo carried the ghost of a name, not spoken but felt, the Hades Wardens. Lord Inquisitor Hans stood in the center of the psychic storm, his mind a fortress of discipline against the alien onslaught. He cross-referenced the raw data with the official report from Battle Group Omega. The lie was immediately, glaringly obvious. The report spoke of a minor Xenos outpost. The psychic echoes screamed of a fully awakened Necron Dynasty, of a magnitude not seen since the Damnos incident. The Ninth Penal Crusade was not martyred in a heroic reconnaissance. They had been abandoned and fed wholesale into the maw of a slumbering god, and in their final moments, they had managed to scream a warning back from the depths of hell itself. "Get me Admiral Vance of Battle Group Omega on a secure channel." Han's voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling promise of retribution. "Inform him that he is to hold his position and prepare to be boarded. His fleet is now under inquisitorial authority, and send a message to the Adeptus Mechanicus on Mars. Highest priority. Tell them we have acquired what appears to be the complete operational codex for a major Necron dynasty. Their price for analysis will be a full expeditionary fleet." He turned to his aide, a severe-looking woman with a data slate permanently affixed to her wrist, and began a file. Title it, "The Xylos Annihilation." Cross-reference the Ninth Penal Crusade. I want every name, every service record, every last scrap of data on the men and women who were sent there to die. Their sacrifice will not be a footnote in some admiral's fabricated report. It will be the opening chapter in the book of a new war. The whispers had begun. The spiteful message of the damned had been heard. Across the sector, the ponderous, grinding gears of the Imperium began to turn. Fleets were rerouted. Regiments were levied. The Adeptus Mechanicus, drawn by the scent of archaeotech and forbidden knowledge, began to mobilize their own arcane forces. The minor engagement on Xylos was about to become the epicenter of a conflict that would consume worlds and cost billions of lives. The Hades Wardens, in their final act of defiance, had not saved the sector. They had merely sounded the alarm, setting the stage for a far greater, more terrible war to come. Within the heart of the Great Pyramid, the nature of reality had changed. The universe of blood, sweat, and screaming metal was replaced by a silent, sterile labyrinth of light and mathematics. The handful of wardens who had carried Valerius through the gate found themselves in a corridor that was not a corridor, a space that seemed to stretch into infinity, its walls composed of shifting streams of green dataglyphs. There was no gravity, only a sense of directional purpose that gently pulled them deeper into the structure. "By the throne, where are we?" one of the troopers whispered, his voice sounding small and thin in the vast silent chamber. "We're inside the machine," another answered, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "We're inside its mind." Their desperate animal instinct was to find a place to hide, to fortify, to make a last stand. But there were no corners to defend, no doors to barricade. The very architecture was fluid, responding to their presence. Passageways closed behind them, and new ones opened before them, gently but inexorably guiding them towards the pyramid's core. The tomb was not fighting them. It was processing them, categorizing them as it would any other foreign data packet that had breached its firewalls. They soon realized they were not alone. Ghostly, translucent figures flickered at the edge of their vision, the after-images of Necron minds, the consciousnesses of long-dead nobles and warriors stored within the crypt's databanks. They took no notice of the humans, lost in their own eternal, silent reveries. The Wardens were biological contaminants in a digital heaven, and they were being systematically quarantined. Their journey ended in a vast spherical chamber. At its center, suspended in a cage of crackling energy, was a single pulsating sphere of brilliant green light. This, they instinctively knew, was the master control node, the central consciousness of Xylos. Around the chamber, alcoves lined the walls, and as the Wardens entered, energy fields snapped into place, trapping small groups of them in separate, sterile cells. The machine was isolating and studying them. Only the two men carrying Valerius were drawn towards the central sphere. They were deposited on a small platform before it, and a shimmering field separated them from their comrades. One of the men, a corporal named Silas, looked down at the still, comatose form of the tech adept. Valerius's face was serene, but his skin was cold, his life signs fading. Silas knew, with a soldier's certainty, that they had only prolonged his death by a few minutes. Meanwhile, on the shattered causeway, the process of scouring was clinical and swift. Fair and Enhutek the Unsleeping stood for a long moment, surveying the damage to his form and the desecration of his bridge. The raw, chaotic mark of humanity was an ugly stain on his perfect world. His anger was not a hot human emotion, but a cold, precise algorithm of retribution. With a silent command, he summoned his forces. Canoptek spiders, great multi-limbed constructs, scuttled onto the causeway. They moved among the dead, their mandibles and manipulator claws working with horrifying efficiency. They did not collect the bodies of the fallen Wardens. They atomized them, breaking them down with molecular disruptor beams, erasing every last physical trace of their existence. The living metal of the bridge flowed like liquid, sealing the cracks and scorch marks, leaving the surface as pristine and unblemished as it had been for 60 million years. The damaged Lichguard were escorted away by Canoptek wraiths, phasing through the solid walls of the pyramid to be taken to repair crypts deep within. The entire battlefield was being wiped clean, scoured of all evidence that a battle had ever been fought. The Hades Wardens were being erased from history for a second time, not by the cynical bureaucracy of the Imperium, but by the cold, absolute order of the Necron Dynasty. Anhutek's attention then turned to the pyramid, to the biological contaminants still fouling its sacred core. His own consciousness flowed into the machine, his will merging with the tomb's master program. He appeared before the trapped Wardens not in his physical form, but as a colossal, godlike image projected from the central sphere. "You have seen the inner workings of my soul, vermin," his voice echoed, not in their minds, but from the very walls of the chamber. "A privilege no lesser being has ever been granted. You have desecrated my home and broadcast my secrets. The price for this heresy is oblivion." The energy fields around the trapped Wardens intensified, the light within them shifting from green to a blinding, furious white. The men screamed a final, desperate cry. As their bodies were unraveled, their atoms scattered and repurposed as raw energy to feed the tomb. One by one, the cells flared and then went dark, their occupants utterly annihilated. Finally, only Silas, his companion, and the dying Valerius remained. Anhutek's glowing visage turned to them. "Your messenger is dead. Your message, a pointless shriek into an uncaring void. Your sacrifice has achieved nothing." As if in response to this final, arrogant declaration, Valerius's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the eyes of a man. They were pools of pure blue-white static, the color of the data scream he had unleashed. A single final thought, not his own, but the psychic echo of his broadcast, pulsed from his mind, a defiant whisper against the God Machine's roar. "They know," he thought. And then he was gone, his body finally shutting down, the last spark of life extinguished. The Pharaon paused. For a flicker of a microsecond, the cold certainty in his projected face was replaced by something else, a sliver of doubt. The echo of the broadcast lingered. The stain was not just on his bridge, it was now loose in the galaxy. He had won the battle, scoured his world clean, but the war had just begun. With a final surge of cold fury, the white light consumed the last two wardens, and the central chamber of the tomb of Xylos fell silent once more. The tomb world of Xylos fell silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of slumber, but the deep, resonant hum of a fully awakened and operational war machine. Legions of Necron warriors stood in perfect, silent ranks in the vast assembly crypts beneath the Crimson Plains. Fleets of crescent-shaped Cairn-class tomb ships and swift Dirge-class raiders began to detach from their ancient berths, their drives glowing with the cold, green fire of captive stars. Farron and Hutek the Unsleeping, his form fully restored to its pristine state, stood on the command deck of his personal vessel, the Eternal Sovereign, and watched as his 60-million-year-old dynasty prepared to reclaim its birthright. The insignificant biological infestation had been purged, but it had left behind an undeniable and infuriating legacy. A timetable had been accelerated. The Great Awakening was no longer a matter of slow, patient revival. It was now a war footing. Across the Segmentum Pacificus, the legacy of the Hades Wardens began to bloom like a corpse flower. The inquisitorial investigation into Admiral Vance and the command staff of Battle Group Omega was swift and brutal. Stripped of rank and honor under the cold gaze of Lord Inquisitor Han, Vance confessed to falsifying the reports, admitting he had abandoned the Penal Legion to avoid risking his valuable ships against an unknown threat. His last words before a bolt pistol ended his career and his life were a bitter complaint about acceptable losses. He and his staff were the first casualties of the new war the Wardens had begun. The data scream, though fragmentary and psychically toxic, was a treasure beyond compare for the Adeptus Mechanicus. Tech priests on Mars and a dozen Forge worlds worked in outside noospheric data looms carefully reconstructing the shattered pieces of the awakening protocols. What they uncovered was a terrifyingly clear picture of the Anhutek dynasty. They learned the names of its cryptex, the dispositions of its legions, the locations of its lesser tomb worlds, and its ultimate strategic goal, the systematic extermination of all life within the Damocles Gulf, to be followed by a push towards the sacred soil of Terra itself. The Hades Wardens had not just warned of a monster, they had provided a complete anatomy of it. This knowledge came at a catastrophic cost. The sector was plunged into a frantic, desperate mobilization. Worlds that had known a relative peace were stripped of their regiments and resources. The second sphere expansion was not just halted, it was completely reversed, its forces pulled back to form a defensive cordon against the coming storm. The war that followed was unlike any the sector had known. It was not a war of territory, but of extermination. The Necrons did not seek to conquer, they sought to cleanse. Worlds fell not to invasion, but to systematic depopulation, their inhabitants harvested by silvery machines that descended from silent, black ships. Yet, for the first time, the Imperium was not fighting completely blind. Armed with the Warden's stolen knowledge, Imperial commanders could predict fleet movements. They knew which worlds were primary targets and which were feints. They could identify the command structure of the Necron forces, allowing for targeted assassination strikes by Deathwatch kill teams. It was a brutal, bloody war of attrition that the Imperium was still losing, but it was losing slower than it should have. The Hades Wardens, in their final act, had not given the Imperium victory. They had given it a chance, a sliver of hope, in the face of certain doom, and in the grim calculus of the 41st millennium, that was a prize beyond measure. The Hades Wardens themselves were never officially acknowledged. Their records remained purged, their names lost to the bureaucratic archives. They were criminals and degenerates, condemned and forgotten. But whispers endured. Soldiers fighting on the blasted plains of a dozen worlds would tell stories of the ghosts of Xylos, a legion of the damned who had fought a god machine and, in dying, had cursed it with the gift of foresight for its enemies. Astropaths who survived contact with the psychic echo of the data scream would sometimes dream of a defiant Cadian colonel, a heretical tech priest, and 10,000 angry souls marching into a green-lit abyss. The legacy of the Hades Wardens was thus twofold. In the grand tapestry of the galactic war, their sacrifice was the critical thread that allowed the Imperium to mount a defense against the Anhutek dynasty, saving countless billions from silent metallic death. But for the men and women themselves, their legacy was one of pure, undiluted spite. They were condemned to die forgotten, but they refused. They clawed their way back from the edge of oblivion to hurl one last, defiant curse at the galaxy. They died as they had lived, damned, broken, and utterly, magnificently indomitable. Their final act was not one of salvation, but of vengeance, a warning born of pure, distilled hatred for the masters who had betrayed them and the enemy that had scorned them. They were not heroes. They were the Hades Wardens, and their spite would echo in the stars long after their names had turned to dust.